One of the first materials that I hope you took a look at in preparation for the end of the week was the Intro to Semiotics. Semiotics is the study of how things mean what they mean. It's the study of where meaning comes from. That's the reason that I assigned it. One of the most important considerations of this project is knowing exactly where meaning is coming from by being able to acknowledge our own choices about what's meaningful. In terms of this video, one of the first things that the speaker does is mention what he calls the blue curtains. And these things become an example of the way that sometimes we're not really sure where people's interpretations come from. We might only see the blue curtains as they hang there, maybe blocking the light out, maybe not. Whereas somebody who is looking at the blue curtains specifically for their overarching significance might well see the sorts of things that our speaker mentions. He talks at one point about the blue curtains somehow being indicative of the main character's lack of drive and feeling of depression. Following this, we are first introduced to the intentional fallacy and interpretation based on the fallacy. Remember that the intentional fallacy is the idea that we can best interpret literature based on what we think the author meant. The problem is that once a piece of literature is published, it's released to the world and away from the author. That's it. There's really no direct relationship between the literature and the author after that point. Again, based on the way that people who interpret literature understand it as working. What this means is that crafted writing or intentionally artistic writing, such as fiction, belongs to the public. It is up to the public to decide what it means after that moment of publishing. Another example that we see is the sculpture that we are told somehow means human suffering. Well, if we look at it, and even though we're told it means human suffering, we can't really see how. That doesn't make us wrong. It just means that we're seeing a different significance in it. Lastly, and this is a really big part of it for me because I studied linguistics when I was in graduate school, all of this comes from the fact that language and therefore meaning is arbitrary. Our language changes and grows because every so often the speakers of our language collectively agree that some new word means something that it didn't before. The first example to come to mind for me is the word yeet, Y-E-E-T. My children love it. I don't understand it. As a result, for me, that addition to language hasn't entirely happened yet because of the fact that not all speakers of the language formally agree on what it means or if it means anything. The next piece of reading from last week was a look at the Wikipedia entry on close reading. I've taken a short excerpt from the first few lines of that. Close reading is the, quote, careful, sustained interpretation of a brief passage of a text. Close reading works through identifying the characteristic of single sites within what is being analyzed and constructs its analysis through linking all of those individual sites of analysis together. It does not work through making assertions about what is true in general. A close reading actually cultivates specific pieces of evidence based on what it finds in specific passages, rather than looking for anything that it can say of the entire piece. As a result, quote, a true close reading of a 200-word poem might be thousands of words long and still leave more to be said. The next thing that we looked at was pen and the pad on analytical response papers, and this was there as a way of subtly or perhaps not so subtly reminding everybody that there's more to this than just summary. The first thing that pen and the pad, remind us to do is check the assignment directions, an important thing. I know that quite a lot of you found yourselves going back to the assignment directions for the first essay. An analytical response paper is not only your opinion and whether you agree or like the material, but it should include why you feel the way you do. And of course, this represents the evidence and other support that we'll be using as we write this essay. The authors next remind us to write an outline to focus on structure and support, and this is really big. It's difficult for anything that we write to make a useful, logical appeal unless the organization of it is logical as well. As we write the draft, quote, write as if the reader has not read or seen the material making up the topic of the essay and provide a little background into the topic. For what we'll be doing, we need to write as though the reader has never read the short story we choose and furthermore never will. As a result, the only thing that reader will ever know about the story is the summary that we provide to that reader, so he or she understands the way we interpret that summary. Lastly, we've got to make sure that we read through the essay and ensure that it's well written and logical, just because that is the last chance we have to exert any control over our writing before we do our own publishing of it. That is to both the discussion forum and also Blackboard. I asked you to think a little bit about what literary analyses are all about. This is where the reader creates and has always created textual interpretations. Again, once the piece has been published, it belongs to the public, to the readers. When a piece of literary writing is published, it becomes larger than the author, more varied, more powerful, and, like I said, more than the author. Remember that literary analyses are about smaller parts in specific places within the text. The literary work itself becomes more than the sum of its parts, in the same way that, as we just discussed close readings, the close reading can go far beyond just the few words that it originally had to do with. After that, I wanted to take a couple of pieces of reasoning from the people who'd made posts and just quote from those. Annalise Soto in my EN 100-07 talks about it as being a mindful reading of the story. I really like that, particularly the mindful part of it. Any of us who are familiar with the concept of mindfulness, we know that it has to do with our ability to not just go through day-to-day life, but constantly be mindful of the way that we do it, the values that we hold to be important, the reasons that we have for doing particular things in particular ways. Overall, then, the mindful reading of the story means that we are considering ourselves as a part of that reading, just as much as we're considering whatever's in the story. Lucas Novakovic from my EN 110 mentions the fact that meaning is always the product of context, time, and the people who read the text, and that's really big too. I wanted to talk briefly about some things not to do in literary analyses. Number one, avoid phrases like the author writes that, or the author is trying to get across the point that. These should be pretty clear. Just think a couple minutes ago now to the discussion of the intentional fallacy. You'll see why these things are worth avoiding. Following that, please stay away from assertions like everyone sees everything in different ways, so what I see is. Certainly, there is bound to be some variety in the ways that we interpret what we read, but that's not infinite variety. There are certainly some interpretations that are not warranted, right? So like we said before, for Mr. Novakovic, again, meaning comes from context, time, and people, right? So there will be a large variety of different interpretations, but any interpretation that's too far outside of that context, time, and people formulation is most likely one that we would have a hard time justifying with evidence from the text. Avoid assertions like if you read between the lines or if you go beyond the words. Either one implies a certain amount of guesswork there. If you have to guess to get at the meaning of the reading, you are almost certainly not going to be able to back that up in any sort of convincing way. Certainly avoid an assertion like the meaning of the text comes from what the reader feels about the text. To say that it's what the reader feels is to get at a kind of gut level response. I'm fine with that being the very beginning of an analysis, but after that gut response leads us in the right direction, we still have to be able to back up everything we're saying. Lastly, please avoid anything along the lines of analyzing literature is knowing about the author's experiences and background. It doesn't matter how much of the author's biography we know about. The very basics, the very beginnings, in fact, of literary analysis tell us that we just can't let that into what we're doing in our analysis. So really what that means for us is, for all intents and purposes, we need to think about the author as dead. Lots of them are. Lots of the literature we read comes from people who lived a long time ago, but it's not universally the case. Instead, and you'll notice that I've got a link here to The Death of the Author from Roland Barthes, the idea is that, from Wikipedia, quote, readers must thus, according to Barth, separate a literary work from its creator in order to liberate the text from interpretive tyranny. Each piece of writing contains multiple layers and meanings. Basically, we need to think about the author as being dead so that we're not at all compelled to tie our interpretations to what we think the author could have meant. Again, whatever the author meant doesn't really matter, and the further we can distance ourselves from the author, the more room that we've got, the more space we have to be able to advance and then back up an interpretation of our own. Again, so long as we can show the evidence and support that we have for it as we go. Now, last note on the cultural perspective papers, I'll have those corrected and turn them back as soon as I can. And make sure you know that you will have a chance to revise those a final time if you want to once you get those back. For now, everybody, have a lovely day, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.